We have been looking at conceptualization. And in the last chapter, chapter 6, we're conceptualizing, who can tell me the kind of 3 areas that we want to explore in conceptualization? When we're conceptualizing a client's problem, when we're trying to make sense of the case, the treatment planning, what are the 3 areas that we are, or the 3 kind of questions that we're asking? Yes. Exactly. How did this problematic issue originally develop in their familial or their early childhood experiences? How is this problematic interaction continuing to occur with significant others in this person's life? And how are these problematic ways of interacting coming up in the here and now with the therapist? What, in the interpersonal theory, why do we believe that someone develops anxiety or depression? What's the kind of basic idea, the basic underlying mechanism that brings about these emotional difficulties, these disorders?
They're usually the symptoms of like a need or a wound that like happened in childhood between the caregivers and the child.
Yes. They're a symptom of that, but what I would add to it, Nick, did you have something to add there?
It's like a way to avoid the anxieties in their life.
Yes, right. So those two combined, right? So it typically developed from problematic sequences in the home life, but then the reason that people are anxious isn't actually necessarily like because of that thing that happened. It's because they haven't resolved it, so they're still acting it out, right? And in this chapter, we'll talk about these strategies of moving towards, moving away, moving against, treating yourself as your caregiver did, treating others as your caregiver treated you, or trying to get other people to treat you the way that your caregiver treated you, eliciting the same problematic responses from others. These are all ways that we seek to cope with these problems. But the reason that they can never fulfill our needs, the reason that they never work, is because they're all in some way avoiding, right? And I've heard it said, and I think I'm in large agreement with this, that all of psychological dysfunction can come down to this core problem: avoidance. All psychological issues, in some way, at their core, operate through some aspect of avoidance, denial of reality, shaping reality to be more easily to bear. But avoidance, really, we can see at the core. And so as long as we're avoiding the core issue, as long as we're seeking to avoid the pain, that difficulty will never, ever get resolved because we're not working on it. So what we seek to do is help clients to understand how their core issues are stopping them from feeling the way they want to feel, thinking the way they want to think, and living the lives that they want to live. And we see that anxiety that somebody feels is the constant fear of kind of getting hit by that developmental issue, right? I'm avoiding getting rejected by my boss. So I'm doing all this work, I'm doing that work, I'm working overtime, I'm doing so much, right? I'm avoiding that rejection, That's going to create burnout. That burnout's going to create anxiety. That burnout's going to create other issues. And I might come in for depression, right? Because I'm so overworked that I'm just completely depleted and my emotional tanks are drained. But if we treat the depression as such, we're going to miss the fact that actually the issue is that I'm trying to avoid the rejection and the shame that I experienced once because I can never go there. What we want to work through with our clients is saying like, hey, I can go there with you. Yeah, that place of rejection sucks, but like we can actually go there. You couldn't be in that place of rejection earlier in your life because it would have been too unsafe. But it's different now. You're an adult. You can do this. So we're seeking here to understand. Last chapter we looked at developmentally, how do these things occur? We looked at attachment styles. We looked at family parenting styles. Now we're looking at chapter 7, these inflexible coping strategies. Essentially, how are these problems coming up with other people? How are they going to come up in the session? In the next session, we'll look at process more. How are they coming up in the session? But in order to conceptualize clients, our interpersonal framework, we're looking at the unmet developmental needs. So asking, what was this client missing in their childhood? What did they need from their caregivers that they didn't receive, right? These create core conflicts. We're looking at the internal working models that were developed based on those unmet needs, what they believe about the self, what they believe about others. We're looking at their developmental, their interpersonal strategies. Meaning, how does this person interact with other people? And then we're looking at what is the resolution. And what is the core of a resolution for our clients' issues? What are we seeking to give our clients? When we think about the three fundamental kind of pillars of the interpersonal framework, chapter 1. Okay, secure base perhaps, but not, that doesn't quite hit it on the head. Corrective emotional experience. That's what resolution is. Remember, client response specificity can be best described as what relational experience does this person need in order to change? And if we want to understand what relational experience this person needs to change, we need to understand what was the problematic relational experience in which their needs were not met. How have they developed internal working models that's ways to see the world to make those unmet needs feel a little bit less problematic? How have they learned to deal with this pain and this shifted worldview with other people so that we can create a corrective emotional experience? We give the clients not an explanation of all this, not a description, not a, well, here's how you change your thinking. We want to give our clients an experience rather than an explanation. An experience that says, when you bring your emotions to me, I can respond in a better and more helpful way than you've experienced before. And so this breaks down here. We look at the unmet needs, the need for a safe haven. A safe haven is a place to bring emotional pain and difficulty, and a secure base. A secure base is a place to go out from, to explore. When our clients don't experience those things, they have to develop some sense of understanding. So if you look here at unmet needs, I love this quote. So children develop internal working models based on their parents' unresponsiveness, which continues to shape their feelings and perceptions about themselves and others into their adulthood. There's this wonderful quote here on page 228. In turning against themselves, and this is a little bit ahead, but I think it frames it very well. In turning against themselves in this way, what we're looking at is, why do clients come to believe they're bad? Why does the child believe, oh, I'm too needy? Why does the child believe I'm too demanding? Why does the child believe that my feelings don't matter? Routinely, counselors will hear clients say the same hurtful responses towards themselves that others originally expressed to them. Why are you so bossy? In turning against themselves in this way, children are able to ward off the unwanted anxiety that would be brought about if they felt that their developmental needs were reasonable and legitimate, but still viewed as unacceptable to those that they love the most, their caregivers. That's a terrifying world to think it's easier to believe I'm flawed and I'm too needy. This is how these problematic internal working models develop. When our needs aren't met, we change the view of the world, right? We develop these internal working models which are distortions of reality in order to fit our experience and make it more safe. There's a saying that I read, and I butcher it every time, and I need to go back and find the quote exactly. But the saying is something like, it's easier to believe that you are evil in a world ruled by a good God than to believe that the world is unpredictable and your parents are dangerous. It's easier for us to believe that I'm the problem and that's why I'm getting beaten than to believe my caregiver, who I rely on for every single need that I have, is unpredictable, unresponsive, unable to meet my needs, unable to provide me security, and perhaps doesn't love me. Because if I'm cut off from my caregiver, I'm cut off from being itself. I'm cut off from everything that I need to live. And so we develop these ways of viewing the world, our perspective of others, our perspective of ourselves, these internal working models, in order to make sense of, well, why are my needs not being met here? And so the two main ways that these internal working models show up here, these are intrapersonal consequences, right? Intrapersonal means they're ways that we're dealing with the world that are inside of our mind. They're inside of the way we relate to ourselves. And we avoid the anxiety. Let me see where I lost my spot. So we'll respond to ourselves as the caregiver did, right? We'll learn, I'm going to treat myself, right? If mom and dad said, you know, you are a terrible person, if mom and dad are critical and overbearing, one of the ways that we learn to avoid the fact that there was pain in the way that they were treating us is that's gospel. We turn towards ourselves and we treat ourselves as our caregiver did. It's a pretty scary thing to realize that there's this belief, and Murray Bowen talked about the differentiation of self, right? The differentiation of self we've talked about before in class is the goal of the family to teach children that they are both fully their own person and a part of the community. Oftentimes when children don't experience this, they polarize towards either a radical individualism or a radical kind of tribal togetherness. A lot of times kids grow up and they say, you know what, I'm going to get out of my house as soon as possible, and they do what's called an emotional cutoff. They move far, far, far away from their parents in the country. But what's really difficult is that they believe that they've cut off from their parents, but really there's this quote, and the quote's something like, it's not so clear whether you live in your family or your family lives in you. This is the part of the fundamental belief about internal family systems theory, right? Is that we internalize the voice of our caregivers, and that internalized caregiver voice, which Freud and the dynamic theorists would call the superego or the introject, then tells us what we need to do. And when we do something good that mom or dad would have said, good job, we praise ourselves, we feel good. And when we do something bad, something that mom and dad would have punished, we punish ourselves. Oftentimes, we are actually punished many people are punished in their childhood for success, right? They can have parents that are jealous of them. So then you have people who are successful in treatment and then have this panic attack. You're like, what's going on? Things are going great. And that's exactly the thing, because they're treating themselves as their caregiver did. Another way that we avoid the pain and the difficulty is to treat others the way that our caregivers treated us. And so this is a little bit of a harder thing to wrap our minds around, and that's because it's less conscious. Yeah, Nick.
That kind of explains why, like, young school children, like, would be a bully if their parents are, like, abusing them. They're taking out their angers down the inside and projecting them onto the other kids. Like, that's how they've always been treated.
Exactly, and the only way you can do that is if you repress the weakness and the frailty that you feel when you are being abused, right? So if somebody is mistreated, that's a painful experience. And if they have no place to process that, right, where does that go? It goes into a box, duct tape shut, big lock and chain, and it's shoved down as far as possible. So they are actually disconnected from vulnerability. They're actually disconnected from what it feels like to be abused, right? Any capacity that they have for empathy that would say, hey, don't treat other people like this, is locked in a box and broken off from conscious awareness. And so whatever yellow lights or red flags that say, hey, you shouldn't kick this person, you shouldn't beat this person, you shouldn't yell at this person and say names. Well, mom and dad said that to me, or brother and sister said that to me, or school teacher said that to me, or priest or religious said that to me, or random passerby on the street said that to me. And so they're treating others the way that they were treated. And what that does is it actually also gives them a place of power and doesn't have to connect them to the weakness. What they can do is they can punish the weakness they've seen in themselves, in other people, and that actually also psychologically gives them an experience to say, I'm going to avoid being the one on the bottom, I'm going to be the one on the top. And that's going to give me a sense of power in my life. Because remember, deep down under this is still this experience of deep vulnerability and this experience of powerlessness. And so one of the things that I realized in my studies that was a really scary thing, and I think I've said this in class before, was if you want to be a good parent, ask yourself, how do I respond to myself when I'm angry? How do I respond to myself when I make a mistake? How do I respond to myself when I let myself down? How do I respond to myself when I let other people down? How do I respond to myself when I just do something stupid? Right? That will show you how you're going to respond to your children when they let themselves down, when they let you down, when they do something stupid, when they're angry, when they make a mistake. Right? Because the way we treat ourselves is the way we treat others. If we learn to avoid our own needs, we're going to learn to avoid the needs of others. And unfortunately, this is probably it's relevant across all the levels of spectrum of severity, but I'm not quite sure exactly the statistics, but they're staggering and frightening when you look at the perpetrators of sexual abuse. The huge majority of perpetrators of sexual abuse were themselves sexually abused. And so it's something for us to really think about in our therapeutic work. It might be really easy for us to say, oh, we need to be allied on the side of those who are sexually abused, and that is absolutely 100% true. But there's actually also a call for us to say, like, hey, we also need to help perpetrators of sexual abuse. We need to help individuals who have been caught in that cycle, right? We need to learn that there is no justification for the abuse or the maltreatment of another person. But oftentimes, when you look at individuals who perpetrate terrible atrocities, you look at their history, and you can see that there's atrocity upon atrocity upon atrocity that's been committed to them. And you can kind of ask a question of like, okay, were they doing this terrible, vile thing because they wanted to? Or is that just how they've been taught that humans interact with each other? And have they been taught like that's just what you're supposed to do as a human? So when we start looking at the experiences people have and how they perpetuate that towards other people, it gets pretty scary, and it becomes pretty clear that we need to have a better system than, oh, somebody made a mistake, shove them in a box with a bunch of other people that made a mistake for 30 years and then let them go. That system doesn't really, that system of the imprisonment system that we have, it might work pretty well to limit more problems being occurred, but it's not by any means a resolution. Yeah, Mina, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I'm going to ask this based off personal experience. So you said that the way you treat yourself is the way you would treat people. But if, like, what I'm thinking of it, like, if I do something wrong, I'll call myself like you're so stupid. Why did you do that? But, like, if someone else would do it, I'm more compassionate with them.
Yeah. Yes. But you'll see a theme. You'll see a theme, and I bet that the closer you get to people, the more you respond to them the way you respond to yourself, right? So this comes out most immediately with the people that we're most intimate with, because we can't have like kind of a social buffer of like, oh, these other people in general, like I shouldn't treat them like that. So there is nuance. This belief that we treat other people the way we treat ourselves, it is kind of situationally dependent. But overall, you will start, if you start paying attention to this, you will start seeing real themes. And this is why, right, the gospel says, love one another, love your neighbor as yourself, right? And we hear that as like, oh, that's something that we should do, right? That's something that God's telling us to do. We need to love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. But I think it's something that's more of a psychological law than it is kind of God telling us to do something. You will love your neighbor as you love yourself. So that puts a huge weight of responsibility. You better learn to love yourself really, really well. And you better learn to love your neighbor really, really, really well. There's this great quote that I saw, or not a quote, but kind of a thought experiment. I might have mentioned it in class already. But it was talking about, how we take care of our bodies. And the quote was something like, imagine someone that you really love, someone that you really care about and admire. Now imagine that you live in their body for a year. And you're going to have to give their body back to them after a year. Imagine that. What would you eat? What would you drink? How would you exercise? How would you treat yourself, right? What's the attitude you would have? Would you run their body down and beat it up and put all sorts of trash in it? Would you try to cultivate a sense of respect and appreciation and love before you kind of give their body back to them? And it's like that's the same attitude that we're called to have towards ourselves, right? Like the real reality is that we're just another person that we would love. So we need to learn to love ourselves in that way. The issue is that so often we treat ourselves as our caregivers did, because we weren't treated in that way. We weren't treated in that love. Mina, does that answer your question of treating other people the way we treat ourselves?
It does. It's just, I think I'm just thinking too deep in it. Like, it's very early on for me to be thinking too deep into this.
No, there are parts of us that might want to make a lot of exceptions for other people, and those parts of us don't make those same exceptions to ourselves. But when you look at circumstances all alike, And I think it definitely shows up more in intimate relationships when you're close to people. And it's circumstantially dependent too, right? So maybe in team events or maybe in competition or things like that. So when the circumstances are similar, and maybe that's a good way to say it too. When the circumstances are controlled, we treat others the way we treat ourselves. Yeah. And then the other thing that we do is that we, and this is all under how our maladaptive internal working models, is that we elicit the same treatment from others that our caregivers did to us, right? So we oftentimes, you'll find that individuals marry people just like their parents, right? Because there's a certain sense in which there's a stability in that because it's predictable. We kind of know that internal working model. We know it feels like it makes sense. But the book talks about asking for a promotion, right? So if I have this internal self-concept that says like, oh, I don't really deserve a promotion, right? And I go to my boss, and I believe that I don't deserve a promotion because all my life I've been told you don't deserve anything. You know, you're not that good. So that's my belief that I have about myself. And if I go to my boss and I say, oh, well, like, maybe I was thinking about maybe I could be up for a promotion soon. I don't know if I'm there yet or not. I don't really know if I'm good enough. What's the response probably going to be?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, probably not. Maybe we could put it on the table, but maybe you're not there yet, right? So we can, you know, or maybe asking somebody on a date, like, I don't know if you'd want to go out with me or not. It's like, well, do you even want to go out with me if you're going to ask me like that? Like, if you're going to say maybe you might want to go out with me, it doesn't really sound like you're really asking me out on a date, right? We're likely to actually elicit that same response of disconnection, of ambivalence, of questioning. If I don't address that internal issue, I'm going to operate. There's the saying, right? This kind of relates here. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. Right? And so what you expect from other people, you actually set the stage for how they'll kind of perform towards you. And more often than not, we put ourselves in situations where we actually act in accordance with our flawed internal working models that don't accurately represent us, but then we get that reaction from other people and we say, yep, just what I expected. I knew, you know, I knew he didn't value my work, right? I knew he wasn't going to give me what I deserved. I knew she didn't like me, but it's actually because we're kind of begging for it. And this is what happens with our clients. Our clients will act out with us these same ways of being, right? So a client might, for example, just say, oh, I'm no good. I'm no good. I'm not good enough. I never do anything right. What two responses would kind of be pretty easily elicited there? From the therapist, or from people in general.
You're doing fine. You do everything. You're okay.
Yeah, you're doing reassurance, right? You're doing great. You're doing fine. You're okay. What's the other response that might come up?
Like a good response?
Not necessarily. Just what would you most likely expect people to respond with? Don't say that, right? What else along that line of thought?
I mean, my brain just went to like what I would say as a good response. So I was gonna say, why are you thinking of yourself?
Yeah, why are you thinking, like, don't think about yourself that way. Like, so to me too, so those are the kind of sides of like reassurance, right? Don't think about yourself that way. Like, you got it. The other side to me is like frustration and exasperation of like, dude, get a grip, man. Like, come on, like, you got to kind of like pull yourself together, right? So either this kind of like, you got it, it's okay, or, dude, get over it. This client likely had caregivers that were either, right, very indulging when they were in need or dismissive about their needs, right? So they're likely to either elicit indulgence and permissiveness, which doesn't actually help them resolve their core conflict, right, because it's avoiding their core conflict, or dismissiveness and rejection, which again just plays out their core conflict. So when those things are happening, what we're doing in session is, rather than entering into that problematic process, we're just naming it and putting it on the table to explore. So our internal working models are ways that we interpret the world that help us to make sense of our experience. But because our experience is painful, those internal working models oftentimes are rigid, extreme, and unrealistic. And so in recreating these same kind of problematic experiences with other people that we had with our caregivers, we're actually avoiding the core issue, because it's pretty easy for us to externalize as well, right? If I'm continuing to find myself in these situations with my boss where my boss is punitive and my boss is, hurtful, you'll experience this a lot with clients who have severe trauma. You'll be talking a lot about their relationships, like right now. My girlfriend treated me this way again. My boyfriend treated me this way. And it's the same trope over and over and over and over again, right? But as long as they're having dysfunctional relationships in the everyday, every week, what do they not have emotional space to look at? In a client who's experienced severe abuse, they're likely to come in and have a lot of chaotic relationships in their everyday life. And so they'll come into therapy talking about those chaotic relationships. And it's not like it's an excuse. It's not like it's fake. They're not, again, I want to be clear here. Our clients aren't consciously kind of conjuring up these stories because they're like, I don't really want to talk about that, right? They're not doing this in this intentional way. It's just their mode of being in the world. And if they every single day talk about their problem with their boyfriend, their girlfriend, right now, what do they not have space to talk about?
The problems within themselves.
The problems within themselves. Exactly, right? You'll see this especially but what problems within themselves?
The fact that they can't judge what a good relationship is.
Closer. Which feelings? They never. The answer is they never go back to that childhood experience and resolve that. Yes, the original feelings of being neglected, right? If your life is so chaotic, you don't have time to worry about the unresolved issues of the past. And so you'll see this a lot in clients who have OCD or a obsessive compulsive personality type. Lives that are so chaotic and so overwhelmed by doing, that they never have time or space for feelings, right? So there's a way in which the chaos of the obsessiveness of their life actually helps them to avoid their problems, which is the same thing, as they're treating themselves as the way their caregivers did.
My question was just like, we're always talking about it happening in their childhood, and I was wondering if it could ever just be like a situation that just like maybe didn't happen with their parents, but like happened with somebody else, like when they were like a teenager instead. Like, would that have the same effect like later in life, or would it always have to come back to like some traumatic childhood experience with your parents?
What do you think would be the biggest factor in whether a traumatic experience in their teenage years would be successfully resolved or would develop into a malignant, problematic experience that they carry with them for the rest of their lives? So what would be like the biggest factor there?
Well, if they were able to like successfully resolve it, then they probably had a pretty good childhood with like parents that were responsive and took care of them.
Right. And if they had parents that were responsive and took care of them, one of the marks of these individuals is they know when to ask for help and they're confident that they can get it. Right? So I would say, a little bit yes and no. Things can come up, but This is why secure clients we're going to see in therapy less, not because less bad things necessarily happen to them, but because when things happen, they're able to kind of navigate them on themselves. So what happens a lot of times is that problematic childhood experiences create an instability, and then when crisis strikes, the person isn't able to deal with the crisis and the instability because their structure isn't sophisticated or enough. So it's like you might be able to get through life fine even if you had some shaky relationships with your parents. But if your internal working models aren't really appropriate for the world, they aren't flexible, if they're extremely rigid, then it's going to be a lot harder to process things as they come up. Yeah. And so then, again, I want to read this quote again just because I like it. I think it kind of hits the nail on the head. In turning against themselves in this way, children are able to ward off unwanted anxiety that would be engendered if they felt their developmental needs were reasonable and legitimate, but still viewed as unacceptable to those they need and loved the most, their caregivers. This adaptation provides a sense of control and preserves attachment ties. There's just something wrong with me, and allows them to continue the world and their parents as reasonable and just. In this way, a certain kind of attachment security or safety comes from viewing themselves as a problem rather than their caregivers. This then becomes their internal working model for viewing themselves and others. By acting accordingly, they elicit responses consistently with the internal working models. For example, when they ask for something, a pay raise, a day off from work, help with a project, they do it in a way that conveys that they don't really expect that the request will be granted. Consequently, more often than not, their requests go unmet. This adaptation, where children begin to do to themselves and elicit from others in current relationships aspect of what was originally done to them, has also been referred to as modeling or identification with the aggressor. And so these are the intrapersonal ways. This has to do with our rigid schemas and internal working models. We're going to look here at the interpersonal ways. So let's see, IV, is that 4? And we have moving towards. That is a W. Moving away. And moving against. So when this doesn't work, when this provides issues, when they encounter their core issues, clients respond by interacting with people differently in order to continue to avoid their issues. These provide a short-term benefit, but are long-term are problematically. The reality is that we all ought to do all of these, but the difference between somebody who's in desperate need of therapy and somebody who's functional in the world is that somebody who's really highly functional is able to have the flexibility to move between these. Now, what I love about these is that they're just so damn simple, right? And this is where we will see overwhelming these patterns emerge. And so moving towards, individuals learn that in order to deal with the difficult anxieties and emotions that they experience, they move towards the caregivers. They develop people-pleasing. They get very good at telling, what does my caregiver want and how do I give it to them? They get really good at reading the room and kind of serving up whatever the person that they're around needs. The issue is that continues later on in life, right? These individuals are likely to become counselors, maybe you, right? Nurses, clergy, other people in the helping profession, right? Because they've learned, I deal with anxiety by getting close to other people. Now, one thing that's really important for us not to do is say, oh, moving towards people, that's the good way you should cope with your issues. And moving away and definitely moving against, those are bad ways to cope with your emotional issues. We'll talk about this in these kind of being framed as a virtue, but these are all neutral, right? The reality is, and this is when we create empathy, or we give our clients the experience of empathy, is that these are not, they're somewhat based on the disposition of the person, but more often than not, it's what is the best coping strategy to employ in this developmental situation, and the individuals find it themselves. And so individuals who move away, they learn that the best way to reduce interpersonal threats is by getting away, physical distance, emotional withdrawal, or total self-sufficiency. They often expect rejection or rebuff from others. The tendency is often shaped by a heightened sensitivity to rejection, right? So these clients disappear. They get space. They shift away from the threat. The tendency, they often expect rejection, they withdraw, or they have a sense of total self-sufficiency. But their tendency to move away is often shaped by a very high sensitivity to rejection. So this would be characterized by avoidance, right? Or an avoidant attachment, or avoidant personality disorder. The best way to deal with the problem is to get away from it. And then thirdly, the moving against. They learn that aggression and resistance to parental wishes is a way to ward off pain or manage insecurity. The desire to be in control of themselves and their emotions at times dominates. They try to intimidate others. They try to be in control. And it's really easy here to say, like, oh, moving against, that's a bad one. These are just aggressive people. Now, of course, on the extremes, that's what it's going to look like. If somebody only and always moves against people, that's going to be a problem. But who's going to organize the crisis relief program, right? Who's going to be in charge of FEMA? Who's going to be in charge of the Red Cross? Who are the people that are going to show up and be like, okay, we need to get control of this situation. We need to get people here. We need to get people here. We need to get people here. These are all remarkably adaptive, and what we need to be able to do is flexibly employ them when they're appropriate, when they're needed. When we try to do the same thing over and over and over again, right, it's really helpful to be able to jump in a situation and be able to kind of control the situation. But that's not so helpful in a relationship with my wife, right? It's helpful to jump in a chaotic place and be like, okay, we need to do this here, we need to do that here, we need to kind of pull these things together. That's great. But if I'm doing that constantly, right? If I'm telling my kids, if I'm telling my wife, if I'm telling my friends constantly what to do, right? This is certainly what I tend towards, right? There's times in the kitchen where my wife's chopping up an onion. And I'll just feel this desire to be like, well, really, you should chop it this way and this way instead of this way and then this way, right? And here or there, that's something that's like, it's like, who cares, right? It's a suggestion, whatever. But when it's problematic is when it's rigid, when it's like every single thing, when it's with the onion, and when it's with the laundry, and when it's with the routine, or doing this, or what movie, that's when it becomes problematic, right? We want to be able to help our clients and kind of step in and provide some structure. But if that's all we're doing, we are not really seeing the person for what they are. We're so caught up in our own problems. So these interpersonal coping strategies get framed by individuals as virtues. And the question that we can really ask is, are you free? Right? Are you free to go to the soup kitchen? Or is it a compulsion of, no, I have to go to the soup kitchen because if not me, then who? And I have to do these things all the time, right? Are you free to control a group of people in a productive way? Or is it that, no, if there's any sense of a lack of control, I have to tell everybody what to do, right? If there's a group project, I have to make sure that everything's going to get done because if I don't, that anxiety is going to be too much for me, right? Are you free to say, I just don't want to go out tonight. I don't want to go out with this person or do this thing. Or is it like, no, there could be the possibility of rejection there. I'm just going to move away. I'm going to move away. I'm going to move away. Oftentimes, our clients privately frame their defense mechanisms as virtues, right? And this is the kind of classically, if you guys are working in a Catholic setting, which many of you may not, the kind of Catholic, classic church lady who's doing everything for everybody, but is so totally drained and has no sense of boundaries, right? And you can say, oh, well, God says give, right? But there's also a sense that, you have to have the possession of yourself if you are to give it. So individuals who move towards typically see this as the virtue of, unconditional love, generosity, benevolence. Individuals who move away typically kind of value their individuality. A lot of times these people are more creative. These are probably kind of a lot of the homesteader kind of feel where it's like, oh, we're kind of like secretly better than everybody else because we're going to go on and off and be on our homestead, right? Where the moving towards people are kind of like, well, I'm doing what people should really be doing because I'm taking care of people. And the moving against people are saying like, well, I'm doing what people should really be doing because I'm telling people where to go and what to do. And I'm giving people the control and the structure that they need. So oftentimes these defenses aren't seen as defenses. And so actually one of the most brilliant things I have seen in therapy was in my introduction to counseling class in grad school. It was with Father Jocelyn Gregoire. He's a Spirit priest. He's from Mauritius, which is a island off the east coast of Madagascar. And he's just a brilliant therapist. I think I've mentioned it before. He's very good at short-term therapy because a lot of times he only has 1 or 2 sessions with people. And so he does a pretty, what would be considered gestalt therapy that's very kind of present-centered, very interpersonal. But one of the things is he was doing a role play in class and somebody was talking about how they had difficulty setting boundaries. That was she started out like, I'm overwhelmed, I can't set boundaries. And he's a priest, mind you, right? And he's like, well, something along the lines of, well, why do you do that? And she says, well, it's because of my faith. It's like Jesus told me to serve other people. And he essentially just like called BS on it, which is really crazy coming from a priest. He essentially was saying like, can you say no? And she's like, no, well, I can't because it would kind of go against Christian charity. And what he actually did here was she was sitting there, he scooted his chair closer. He said, can you say no? And she kind of looked at him. Can you say no? Like, can you say no? That's crossing my boundary. Can you say no? And what finally, he's like right next to her, the chair is right next to her, and she said, like, no, like, get back, give me some space, right? And that's a Gestalt therapeutic technique, right? That's not necessarily interpersonal, but that's a Gestalt technique that says, let's act out the resolution that this person needs. But because he was a priest, because there was the mutual understanding of the framework, he was able to say like, okay, what you are using, you're using spiritual language to actually avoid the core conflict. That should have been written here forever ago. You're using spiritual language to avoid an inability to set boundaries. You're using Jesus to blame the inability to say no, right? Because what did Jesus do? He went off into the desert for 40 days. And we could really ask him, like, hey, Jesus, why didn't you heal everybody in Galilee? Why did you remove yourself from the people that needed you? Right? But there certainly is something there to say, like, we need to be able to have boundaries, right? And so we frame these ways of coping as virtue. So you'll see people who typically move against, a lot of times will probably be in things like politics, leadership, things like that. People who move towards the helping professions, people who move away, more individualistic, artistic kind of endeavors. But the issue is that in this, they have an unrealistic sense of being special. So they actually place their identity on the defense. I don't know if that's how you spell specialness. And so when, right, it's like I'm exhausted because I've been doing soup kitchens left and right. It's like, but that's what makes me, I'm willing to sacrifice where other people aren't. And that's what kind of keeps me going. Yeah?
Are they being unrealistically special? Or are they,
they're basing their identity on that role. They're unrealistically placing, what they're doing is they're saying, I am what I do.
So they're building themselves off of the role?
Yes, they're identifying themselves with the role and then saying, look at what a good politician I am. I got all these things passed last whatever. Because your identity ought not to be based on what you do. If your identity is based on what you do, you have a very limited control of what you do. What happens when you wake up tomorrow and you don't have use of your limbs? Right? What happens when you get in a car crash? What happens when you lose your voice? Right? What happens when you can no longer control the world in the way that you want? Right? You are not what you do. And this is one of the most problematic, I think, themes in our culture is that there's a saying, right? You are what you repeatedly do. That's this, right? That's a defense framed as a virtue. That's an obsessive compulsive defense. Do good things, do good things, do good things, do good things, and that will make me better than everybody else, right?
I'm just trying to make sense out of this.
Yeah.
But isn't that what the Bible says in a way that if you do good, you're a good person?
There are areas of the Bible that certainly say that. There's other areas of the Bible that say that God loves everybody and everybody has equal dignity and love.
Then they say do good things.
Do good things, right. But the good things are not what make you lovable. The good things are actually that which enables you to experience the relationship. So there's a great priest on last Sunday, Father Drake, he was talking about a shift from this perspective of seeing sin as death as a punishment for sin. Like, oh, you sin, you're getting punished. And what he said is, like, if you jump off the building and you break your legs, breaking your legs is not a punishment for jumping off the building. It's just the natural consequence. Right? It's just seeing death is the natural consequence of stepping out of relationship. But the very fact that we can always enter into a relationship, like the prodigal son, right? As soon as he realized he was off, he was like, this is crazy. Everybody's treated back there better with my dad. I'm going to go back with my dad. It's on the birthright of being in relationship with the Father that he's lovable, not because of what he did. Otherwise, there would be no repentance. There would be no forgiveness. So we are not loved for what we do. We are loved because we are.
I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the whole
Mhm.
Like this wasn't something I was experiencing back home, but it's something like I feel like very like heavily put upon me.
Mm-hmm. I think it is. No, I think it's commonly we are led to believe that you are what you do. That if you don't do good things, you're bad. We are taught to evaluate ourselves rather than valuing ourselves. But what happens is that it is true that our character matters. It is true that it's important for us to do good things, to treat other people well. But that's not the basis of our identity. And that's the key. We're not saying, oh, it doesn't matter if you do good things or not, or that good things don't have any impact on you. What we're saying is, hey, let's disconnect behavior from identity. Right? Because that's what happens in the prodigal son, right? Behavior is disconnected from identity. And the identity as a son remains, no matter what the behavior is. And based on that identity is what creates relationship. Now, in order to be in relationship, if we're acting out of these problematic interpersonal patterns, we're not going to be able to experience relationship. So it's true that these are bad things to do insofar as they take us out of relationship. But the key is that it's actually all about relationship at its core. In that good behavior doesn't make us loved more. Good behavior helps us to be more receptive to the love that's already there. And so we're separating our being from our doing. Right? We said at the beginning class, you're not a human doing. You're a human being. Right? And so there are expectations and needs for how we need to behave in order to experience a relationship, but that doesn't make us better or worse as persons. Pretty good, safe way to think about it is we all have exactly one human dignity. No matter what you do, no matter what you don't, every single person has exactly one human dignity. And that is the basis of our goodness, not our behavior. Now, our behavior has consequences, and our behavior has relational consequences. But it does not determine our goodness or badness. Cool? So we will pick up on shoulds for self and expectations of others. On Thursday, we'll probably do a role play as well.